Alright, so we know the coolest part about getting into photography or filmmaking is the camera. However, it can be one of the most challenging questions because as a beginner, we don't know what we don't know. What camera am I gonna buy? What's a good camera? It all just becomes too much. So to help you through the process, I'm gonna be going through my personal 15 things I look for when buying a camera. Now, this isn't just aimed at beginners, it's really for anyone looking to buy a camera, and I'll be sure to recommend cameras of all shapes, purposes, and prices. Now, remember, there is no perfect camera. Each camera has different pros and cons that you, the buyer, have to weigh out. So with that said, let's talk about it. So first things first is price. This is a key factor to think about when purchasing a camera. How much can I realistically invest into a camera body? And once you set a budget, it condenses the pool of options dramatically. Now, how much should you spend? Well, if I were to graph the amount of people I see using a camera to its price, it would be a bell curve. The left side of the curve would be the sub $1,500 cameras, the middle of the curve being $2,500 to $3,500 cameras, and the right of the curve is the 5,000 plus cameras. To me, this means that the most bang for buck cameras come from the $2,500 to $3,500 price range. So if you want to get a good camera with a nice balance of features, I would look in that price range. I wouldn't, however, invest into new mirrorless cameras under $1,000 because most of the time the specs of those cameras within that budget tend to be comparable to an iPhone. And especially with an iPhone 15 allowing SSD recording and shooting in log, it's honestly a solid choice for very beginners. Next is the age of the camera. The worst feeling is buying a camera, then weeks later they come out with an updated model. However, there is a pro to buying slightly older cameras in that the price of the camera usually drops a significant amount. Take for instance my Red Weapon Helium 8K. It was launched in 2016 at a price of $50,000. Fast forward to now in 2025, it's an $8,000 camera. Or a Canon R5 at launch in 2020 was $4,000 and now goes on the used market for around $2,000. In both instances, they are still very capable cameras at the time of recording this video. What I recommend doing is once you settle on a camera you want to purchase, check on the used market for older models and see what the difference is. And also check rumor sites to see if there's talks of a new model coming out. If you're lucky, a new model could be coming out soon, which means the price of the current model will drop. I will say there are some cons using very old cameras, like unsupported codecs, unsupported accessories, outdated features, etc. But buying a used camera that used to be considered a top tier or professional camera could still very well be a great camera in modern times, like we just talked about with the Canon R5. Then we have resolution, or how much detail the camera can capture video at. This is a spec on cameras that shouldn't be chosen for the heck of it, but instead based on what type of deliverable or end product you plan on producing. Social media platforms only really need 1080p, while narrative films or documentaries require 4K more often than not. Then industries like weddings, real estate, action sports, and commercials have varying requirements. However, like with everything related to camera gear, there are pros and cons to using higher or lower resolutions. While 1080p is a lower resolution, you have smaller file sizes to store, and most modern computers can easily handle editing 1080p footage. But you don't have as sharp of an image in my opinion, and you don't have any wiggle room to reframe or add effects in post. Doing so would just degrade the image further. Then on the other side of the spectrum, we have something like my Red. I can shoot 8K resolution, but the file sizes are massive. For instance, shooting 8K for 45 minutes straight is already 500 gigabytes. I'm able to crop in and reframe as much as I need and still end up with a greater than 4K image. My suggestion is, however, to shoot in 4K. You get the middle or the Goldilocks set of pros and cons. And what's nice is that every camera coming out from beginner to pro has 4K within the camera now. Speaking of resolution, we also have to consider how many frames of that resolution we can shoot at, also known as frame rates. This is measured in frames per second. Now, the most common frames per second you'll see are 24, 30, and 60 frames per second. 24 frames per second is used when you want to capture video that is real time or true to life. Stuff like talking heads like this, documentaries, narrative films, and YouTube videos are usually shot in 24 frames per second. 30 frames per second is primarily used in a television setting. This provides a few more frames per second to smooth out the image, but subconsciously tells our brains it's a video, whereas 24 frames per second is more cinematic. Then we have 60 frames per second, which is when you want to shoot smooth, slow motion. This is common for B-roll sequences, wedding videos, real estate, etc. Shooting more frames per second allows us to slow down the footage back to 24 frames per second and still look smooth and true to life. When purchasing a camera, I like to look for 4K 60 frames per second cameras, since that's what I'm using about 80% of the time. Luckily, that spec is becoming more and more available, with mid-tier cameras even seeing 4K at 120 frames per second now. Be aware that the more frames per second you shoot at, the bigger the file sizes will become. Number 5 is going to be the sensor size. This is referring to the physical dimensions of the sensor in the camera. The sensor size determines a few things: how much can your lenses see, the depth of field, and the maximum resolution of that camera. Now, in filmmaking, we'll see a wide range of sensor sizes, but in particular, there are 4: full frame, APS-C, micro four thirds, and 1-inch sensors. Now, with all 4 of these sensors, they each have things to consider, namely what lenses will work with each sensor and what crop factor you'll have to take into account. On full frame sensors, most lenses are true to scale. In other words, a 24-70 on a full frame sensor will be 24mm and 70mm. But take the same 24-70 lens and put it on an APS-C camera. Most APS-C cameras have a 1.5 times crop when compared to full frame. Thus, we take 24 times 1.5, which gives us 36. Then 70 times 1.5 gives us 105 millimeters. So our 24-70 on an APS-C sensor really is a 35 to 105 lens. So when you're shopping, you'll want to ensure that the lens you buy works with the camera. More often than not, that's listed in the spec sheet of the lens. And an easy tip to remember is that a person can only go down a slide, meaning full frame lenses work on all sensors, but micro four third lenses don't work on full frame sensors. Doing so will mean that you'll see the inside barrel of the lens, rendering your image useless. Then with all 4 sensors, we have varying performances in low light, which is our next topic. Low light performance is a key thing to consider, especially if you're not sure of the environment you're going to be shooting in and or have little control over the lighting in that environment, like in run and gun shooting scenarios. We always want our image to be as clean and sharp as possible, and when you have a sensor that's not good in low light, it introduces noise or little artifacts in your image. Full frame sensors tend to be better in low light. Since it's a bigger sensor with more surface area, each pixel on that sensor can be bigger, thus allowing more light to come onto each pixel. With APS-C sensors, we still want the same amount of pixels, but now we have a smaller surface area, thus meaning each pixel has to be smaller, and then again allowing less light to enter each pixel. Something to keep in mind is that each camera manufacturer's sensors have varying performance in low light as well. Sony, for instance, is regarded in having the best low light sensors. An APS-C sensor from Sony can still outperform better in low light when compared to a full frame Canon or Blackmagic camera. Speaking of camera manufacturers, we have to mention our next point, which is their color science. Each manufacturer has their unique color science, or how colors are captured onto the sensor and then translated back to the recorded video. Sony back in the day was notorious for having bad color science. Blues in real life would come out to be purple and skin tones would look like the person is sick. However, with each iteration of camera, they've improved their color science and I actually enjoy their colors now. So with this one, it's more of a personal preference and I recommend looking at some test footage. I know for me, I still love Canon colors and I still think they're one of the best since they tend to have better skin tones skewing more towards the orange magenta, but you really can't go wrong with any camera's color science really, because nowadays they're all pretty close and the differences can be edited in post-production. If you're completely lost on what color science is good and which one to use, I find that Sony, Canon, and Blackmagic seem to be the top 3 in the filmmaking space. Although color science isn't too big of a decision on this list, what is important is the color depth, or the bit rate of the footage. This and the color science go hand in hand. Bit depth is what determines how much you can push and pull your image before the image falls apart. Bit depth is commonly seen in the filmmaking space as 3 numbers: 8-bit, 10-bit, and 12-bit. And as we go up in bit depth, we have exponentially more colors. The most common for intermediate to budget cameras is 8-bit color depth, which is when I'd recommend to not shoot in log, which is a flattened image space which allows more dynamic range or a camera's ability to see from the darkest part to the brightest part of an image. When you have an 8-bit color depth and you shoot in log, more often than not, you will exceed the image's capabilities before getting to the necessary final image, thus leading to banding. Banding is a phenomenon that occurs when the image doesn't have the ability to render certain colors, so the transition between colors is abrupt. Therefore, if you plan to shoot log, I'd recommend at least 10-bit color depth, allowing for exponentially more colors at your disposal. Then if you want to use log and a heavy color grade or LUT, I'd recommend at least 12-bit color depth, again allowing exponentially more colors at our disposal. Most Canon or Sony cameras have 10-bit color depth available in the camera and 12-bit color depth available if you use an external recorder like an Atomos. But for 90% of projects, 10-bit is perfect. If we jump way up to something like Red or Blackmagic, those cameras allow us to shoot 16-bit raw video. which means we have endless amounts of colors to use in our image, thus allowing us to really push and pull that image. And with RAW, we can shoot the footage and adjust things like ISO and white balance after the fact in editing without the footage degrading. Now, this is a premium feature that most cameras don't offer and can lead to larger file sizes, but it is something to mention. With color depth out of the way, let's talk about dynamic range. We touched on this earlier, but dynamic range is the camera's ability to see in the darkest parts and the brightest parts of an image. This is measured in stops. Cheaper cameras tend to struggle with this in comparison to higher, more expensive cameras. Cheaper cameras tend to be on the low side at 10 to 12 stops of dynamic range, while higher cameras have 15 to 18 stops of dynamic range. This is the most important spec that I look at when buying a camera, because a camera with bad dynamic range looks beginner even if you're a pro. Going back to the Red, this can shoot 16.5 plus stops of dynamic range. And in a side-by-side with my FX3, we can see that the camera with higher dynamic range clips later than the camera with lower dynamic range. However, we can combat this even with cameras with low dynamic range by shooting in log, which preserves those shadows and highlights even further on our image and lets us add color back to those areas in editing. Something like Canon C-Log2 or Sony S-Log3 are great profiles that really maximize the sensor's ability to display dynamic range. My goal whenever I'm filming is to try to use the most bit depth and preserve the most dynamic range as possible to keep the image as close to what we see with our eyes. Now, shifting over to physical attributes, let's talk about I.B.I.S or in-body image stabilization. This is a feature seen on higher end cameras where the sensor can physically move around to stable the image internally. Prior to this, we had lens stabilization, which some manufacturers still use, but either option are great ways to take out micro jitters and in some cases even replace sliders or gimbals. Now, like with sensors, some manufacturers have better I.B.I.S than others. Panasonic has the best I.B.I.S in my opinion, with Sony right behind it. Something to know here is that I.B.I.S is a physical process versus regular image stabilization, which is usually using a software. Image stabilization usually captures gyroscopic data within the camera, then plugs it into a fancy algorithm to stabilize your footage. Continuing with the physical features, our next point is the lens mounts. This is the physical mechanism used to connect lenses to the camera body. This is specific to each camera manufacturer: Canon's EF and RF mount, Sony with the E mount, Panasonic with the L mount, and so on and so forth. It's important to consider what lens mount is on the camera because lenses are better investment than camera bodies. A higher tier lens on a cheap body will always look better than the other way around. Hence why I like to look at the lens options available in that mount so that I can grow into them in the future. Something like the Canon RF mount has a very limited selection because only Canon can make RF lenses right now. But something like the Sony E mount has tons of lenses from Sony as well as third-party manufacturers, thus providing more lens options from all price ranges and purposes. Next is battery life. When you're considering a new camera, consider how long each battery lasts and how many do you need to purchase to bring on shoots. Typically, the cheaper, smaller cameras have smaller batteries in them, which means you'll need more. Like a Sony a6400 battery will last about an hour or two, but a Canon C70 battery, although bigger, can last about 3 hours. Then when you jump into the cinema category, you get big clunky external batteries that only last an hour or two. So the mid-tier cameras are where I find camera performance and battery life to be its best. Again, with my Canon C70 back in the day, I could last a whole wedding day on 3 batteries per C70. Now with my Sony FX3, that's jumped to 7 batteries per camera. I always recommend buying more batteries than you need. It just gives peace of mind knowing that you can easily last the whole shoot without charging or running out of batteries. With enough batteries to power the cameras, let's talk about the camera as a whole and its reliability. With some cameras even shooting 4K, 6K, 8K, that's a lot of computing power in these small boxes, leading to heat generation. And so it begs the question, does the camera you're looking at overheat? And will it be reliable when you're on set? Yeah, you can shoot 8K, but if it only lasts 30 minutes and then shuts off, that renders your camera useless until it cools back down. So then at the end, it's not a worthwhile feature to use. Now, most cameras are beginning to introduce internal fans to help cool down the cameras, but that introduces the elements into the internals, which again could be a huge factor if you shoot in the elements a lot. I know my A7 IV is weather sealed and can withstand rain or mud, versus my FX3, which has an exposed vent. It's more susceptible to water or dust. Now, most hybrid or DSLR mirrorless cameras are weather sealed, but cinema cameras is where that can be different. Then lastly is the ergonomics, or how does the camera feel in the hands. This is where I'd recommend going to a local camera shop to feel the camera in your hands, or even renting the camera before you purchase. You'll want a camera that fits into your hands so you can comfortably film with it. If it's too heavy or awkwardly shaped, you'll just have a much harder time using it, or may not even want to use it. By far, my favorite camera to hold was the Canon 1DX Mark II. The curves of the grip and the material on the camera felt great, and I could go all day with that camera. However, something like the Red is a sick camera, but it's a big clunky box with not that many great ways to hold it, which leads me to holding it awkwardly, causing more fatigue faster. Remember to consider the weight. Too light of a camera, you'll see micro jitters in your footage, and too heavy of a camera, you'll also have shaky footage. I like the ones in the middle, like the Canon R5 Mark II or the Sony a7 IV or FX3. They're heavy enough to smooth out micro jitters, but not too heavy where it's killing my arms. Then we have the size of the camera. Is it a small camera that fits in your pocket? Do you need a dedicated backpack or even a huge Pelican case? And does the size hinder your experience from using it? For me, there are times where I want to take the Red, but it also comes with 2 Pelican cases I have to lug around with it. So my personal recommendations for cameras in 3 different price ranges are as follows. For cameras around the $1,500 range, I recommend the Sony FX30, the Canon R7, or even the Lumix S5 2X. Then in the $2,500 to $3,500 range, I recommend the Sony FX3, Canon R6 Mark II, or even the Canon R5C. Then if you're shopping for a very high tier camera, I recommend the Sony FX6, Canon C80, or even the Red Komodo X. So as you can see, there are lots of things to consider when buying a camera, and I hope I helped you get a better idea of what you want in a camera. Again, there won't be a perfect camera that checks all boxes, but pick one that checks the most boxes and just get out and create. But that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys enjoyed another video, and I'll be sure to leave the links down in the description to any of the cameras I mentioned today. They are affiliate links and they do support this channel. But as always, I will catch you guys next time.